Hello. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Emily, and I know this is very, very late, but let's make all my October reading journal pages and set up my November intro pages together. My first read of October was Kiss Me Maybe by Gabriela Gomez. This is the second book in one of those interconnected romance series and follows our main character as she explores her identity after coming out as an asexual lesbian. There isn't a ton of imagery heavy elements in this one, so for the decor, I kind of just went with fun stationery that was colorful in order to match the colors on the cover. I also pulled out some of these freebie stickers that I have that are of women in a bunch of different poses. One of the pretty important elements in this book is social media. So, one of the girl stickers that I selected is one that has a computer on it. And then for the other one, I just picked a random one that I felt fit the other main character's vibes. I also pulled out some city skyline PET tape because the main non-romance plot in this book involves a scavenger hunt around the city the characters live in. For the headers, I used a pink-purple color and did a brush lettering similar to the title on the cover of the book. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I really liked the romance in this book and liked what we got of the side characters, but I felt like all of those elements had to kind of take a back seat for the scavenger hunt plot, and that felt like it didn't really even go anywhere significant ever. So instead of adding to the story and characters, that whole plot thread instead ended up taking time away from all the elements I wanted to spend more time with. And this does have a pretty heavy social media element, so some people might have an issue with that. I didn't have as much of an issue with the social media as a whole, but really just the scavenger hunt portion of the social media plotline was really what I felt was not executed very well. There's supposed to be one more book in the series, I believe, and I'm excited to read that when it comes out because I really liked the first book in this series and still enjoyed this one, even though I had some issues with it. And we already kind of got introduced to the couple that we're going to follow in the next book, and I am very intrigued to see how that turns out. For the quote in this one, I didn't really end up writing anything down. I am not sure what happened, but whenever I read anything in ebook format, I usually have it sync with Goodreads, even though I don't use Goodreads to actually keep track of my reading. I'll just use it to keep track of all of my highlights and notes and everything if I read an ebook, since I usually read my ebooks through the library. And for this book, for some reason, all of my highlights got removed, so I couldn't write down anything that I had highlighted, and this one is fairly new and not super popular, so it didn't really have like a quotes page like books usually have on Goodreads, where it has everyone's highlights. So I didn't really end up writing anything down in the quotes for this page. Moving along, the next book I finished was The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alexi Harrow, which is a fantasy short story that follows a girl who sees the Saint of War as a child when she is about to die and is then taken by the prince of this kingdom to train as a great warrior. I can't really say too much else about the plot without giving away some important elements of the story, but for stationery, I wanted it to have a very medieval gothic romantic kind of vibe to it. So I pulled out these washi type stickers that I have of different famous paintings and picked some that have elements reflected throughout the story to kind of pull in some of the imagery from the story, but also give it that kind of romantic medieval feeling, as a lot of these paintings are from the Romantic era. I also used this black lace PET tape I have to add a little bit of a darker element to the page as well. For the font, I just did a plain print in a red color to match the cover. I absolutely loved this short story and gave it 5 stars. I'm so impressed with how much theme exploration and characterization the author was able to create in less than 30 pages. This story was expanded on, changed up, and turned into a full-length novel that came out last month called The Everlasting, and I'm so excited to read that book as well based on how much I loved this short story. I don't think the quote I wrote down really has any spoilers, but in case you want to be safe, feel free to skip over to the next chapter. But the quote is, Gwyn said softly, "Before all this, before the saint and the prince, you were the girl who still shared her meat with the begging dogs, no matter how hungry she was, who took a beating for a boy who deserved it, for no reason except that she could bear it better than him, who shone even in the shadows. He said your name even more softly. You are not a knife. And you said wretchedly, but I am his." Next up was Mooncakes by Suzanne Walker, which is a graphic novel following a witch and a werewolf who were friends as kids and have now reconnected and are trying to figure out what is disturbing the nearby magical forest. I don't really have a ton of stationery that has a very witchy vibe to it, so I mostly just pulled out stationery that is in the same color palette as the cover. I used 3 different yellow and pink papers and then also pulled out a yellow cloud PET sticker. I used the rest of what I used on the Kiss Me Maybe page. There's also a lot of research moments, so I added some book stickers I have to add a little bit of extra decor and tie that element in a little bit. The layout for this page was also slightly modified from how I usually do the layout because I didn't have any quotes I knew for sure for this one since it is a graphic novel. For the headers, I decided to stick with the yellow theme and did a lowercase bouncy kind of font to match the vibes of the title on the book cover. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I liked the characters, but I thought the plot was really unengaging and predictable, and the plot seemed to take more of a focus than the characters and their development, which was a little disappointing to me since that was my least favorite part of the book. Finally, the last book I finished in October was Hungerstone by Kat Dunn, which is a reimagining of Carmilla, with the significant change being in the main character, who is now a married woman who travels with her husband to his inherited country home in order to host an event for investors in his factory when they stumble across our original titular character in a carriage accident. But when she comes to stay with them, women begin indulging in their hunger all over town, and the plot goes from there. I, of course, wanted to go with a very gothic vibe for the decoration of this page and grabbed a couple different pages I have that have those elements on them. For the majority of the decoration, I spent a little extra time on the headers and made them a very gothic font to match the cover typography along with the vibe I was going for. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed the way this reimagined the original story and the original vampire trope that's used in that story. And I really loved watching our main character grow and change throughout the story as well. The one shortcoming of this book was that I felt the themes it was exploring were themes that have been done many times before, and I don't know that this book explored those themes in any new ways or added anything new to those conversations, which I was wanting. I ended up writing 2 quotes down from this book. The first quote was, "I hated her because I did not understand what it was that I had lost before I saw it in her." And the second quote was, "If the world offers me no kindness, then I will take from it armor and sword, create an unassailable fortress for myself, and lock the door." Moving on to my October stats pages. Before I dive in, there was one book I DNF'd in October, and I didn't have a spare page for it, so that will go in my journal wherever I end up having space, and that was Victorian Psycho by Virginia Fido. Okay, into my actual stats pages. To make these match in color and theme to the cover page, there wasn't a ton I could do with the elements because the cover page was all one big piece, so I mostly just had to make the fonts and color scheme match. For the color, I made pretty much all of the headers match the same font style I used on the cover page in this spooky, witchy feeling font with my black paint pen. For the graphs, I ended up using 4 colors that were heavily featured on the cover page, which were a yellow, a brown, a red, and then a pink maroon color. For my numeric stats, I did the titles in silver, and then for any subtitles, I used gold since those were both used on the cover page as highlight kind of covers. All right, on to my actual stats for the month. I read 4 books in October and DNF'd 1. The books I read this month were comprised of approximately 290,346 words. Those words spanned 725 pages and 615 audio minutes. My favorite book this month was The 6 Deaths of the Saint, and my least favorite that I finished was Mooncakes. For format, I read 3 digital and 1 audio. One of the books was YA, and the other 3 were adult. For diversity and representation, one of the books had Latina main characters, one of the books had East Asian main characters, three of the books featured sapphic relationships, one of the books had a non-binary main character, one of the books had a character that identifies as somewhere on the spectrum of asexuality, and one of the books had a deaf main character. As far as genre, I read one book each from the genres of fantasy, graphic novel, horror, and romance. For ratings, one book was 3 stars, one book was 3.5 stars, one book was 4 stars, and one book was 5 stars, giving me an average rating of 3.875. For the author breakdown this month, 3 of the books were written by women, and one of the books had a non-binary author. 2 of the books were written by white authors, one of the books was written by an East Asian author, and one of the books was written by a Latina author. And there you have all my reading stats for October. Before we move into the November setup, as usual, here is a quick flip back through all of my October pages. Onto my November intro page, I really wanted to do like a forest fairy kind of theme. It isn't necessarily season related, but it was just what my heart desired this month, so that's what we're doing. This month, I again started off on the left-hand side with a drawing in the calendar. I used to save this until the end, but I kind of liked getting it out of the way first last month, so I did the same thing this month. I also wanted to make sure I didn't forget to add the first day of the month to my calendar spread from last month, since the month technically spans across 6 weeks instead of 5 this month. I left all the numbering blank for now, as I wasn't sure what color I wanted to use for this month for the numbering, which is also how I end up color coding all my yearly pages that need a specific color for the different months, such as my physical TBR or my 25 in 2025. Once all those lines are done for my calendar page, I immediately just dove into the line work. I knew I wanted to use watercolor for the background, so I knew I would be okay to do the line work and any of the spots I wanted to do with my paint pen first, since they'll still be visible after I paint, even if I end up painting over them. For all the paint pen aspects, I did the vines coming up from the top of the page in a green paint pen. I gave the fairy some gold embellishments, particularly a belt type thing and some armbands. And then I also did some grass at the bottom with a different green paint pen, but left all of the mushrooms and leaves to be colored in with markers, so I would have a bit more freedom with colors, since I have many more markers than paint pens, at least the paint pens that have the finer nib. Last element I ended up doing with the paint pens was the title, which I used a navy paint pen for, and did a pretty simple all uppercase font for that just had a little bit of frilliness to tie in with the fairy. Once I was done with the paint pens, I had all my pencil lines accounted for, so I could go in and erase all that before I went in with the watercolor, so none of the pencil marks got trapped. I then taped off the edges of the page so I wouldn't get paint onto the left-hand page or any of the pages behind this, which took a little longer than I expected because I was trying to line up the one that is going over the left-hand side perfectly, and I kept messing it up. But I did that so I could get a little messier with putting the watercolor down. I then decided to mix up a yellow tinged lighter green for the background. This was probably the hardest thing to decide this month. I had a really hard time trying to decide what color to do in the background, but I figured if the idea is that this is a forest fairy in a forest, she should be surrounded by greenery. I also did accidentally paint over her leg that is wrapped in the vines because I was just not paying attention, so I decided to just paint over the other one as well, so that when I actually went in and colored them, it would at least match the other leg, even if the legs aren't exactly the same color as the rest of her skin. And then I meticulously made sure I didn't paint over any of the other areas that were going to be colored in with different colors, except her wings, because I wanted those to have more of a translucent effect. So I wanted some of that green peeking through whatever I ended up coloring in with later. Now we finally get to move in to color all these elements. I mostly stuck to browns and reds for the elements at the bottom. I had made some brown mushrooms and some red mushrooms, and one more pink mushroom and one gray-brown mushroom. And then for the leaves, I went a very fall route and made them all oranges and yellows for the most part. I did throw in a couple green ones though. And then for the fairy's dress, I went a sort of ombre direction where each layer of her skirt from the bottom up gets a progressively darker pink. For these pinks, I wanted them to look pretty natural, so I picked some of my more muted pinks. I do have some really bright ones that I could have used, but I did not want her dress to look unnatural against the rest of the page, so I went with those more muted pinks just to make them colors that would more likely appear in nature. Then we're just giving her some skin and hair color. I'm really glad that with the color I used, you couldn't tell that I accidentally painted over one of her legs, and it looked pretty much the same as the rest of her skin. Once all the coloring was done, I went back in and touched up any of the paint pen or line work spots that looked covered up by the watercolor, and also decided to add some extra texture lines to her wings to give them a bit more definition instead of coloring over them with a super light marker. And then finally, I picked a forest green color and went back in and added numbers to all of the boxes for my calendar. And I made sure not to forget the one day that I have on the previous calendar page. And there you have my November intro page all finished up. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again very soon since this is coming out so late.